Are we ready?
I think so.
Okay. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Miodrag Mitrašinović, and I'm a professor of architecture and urbanism at Parsons School of Design at the New School in New York City. I'm very happy to be here tonight, and I want to thank first Ingrid and the Architectural Association for hosting the event, and to Bloomsbury as well for supporting the event and for providing also quite a number of books, so that those of you who are interested may wish to get the copy after the event. I'm particularly thrilled to sit with these two gentlemen tonight at this table. Because allow me a personal moment, because the two of them have been fundamental to my life, both professionally and otherwise. And I am very happy to be able to call them my friends. But also, I am also extremely proud and happy that together we have managed to, in fact, put together this I believe, at least to me personally, a very valuable book. Needless to say, you know, in a collaborative but particularly cooperative work, I take all the responsibility for the book. However, the book really has been a collaborative effort. It took 6 years to basically, from the first concept to until today, to bring this book to life. Kenneth and Clive first started talking about it. Clive will say a few words about that, I guess, later on. Both at that time in New York. And so when Clive approached me to edit the book, I first said that's an impossible task. And so I said, I'm not sure I can do that. I mean, for a number of reasons. One, you know, it's such an, I will try to be less laudatory today because I know that Kenneth doesn't like very laudatory remarks, so I'll try to be as, you know, low-key as possible. Yes, modest. So, you know, at first I thought, you know, who can do this? And secondly, you know, am I really qualified to do it? It's such an outstanding body of work. And it spans 50 plus years of publishing, researching, of scholarly work, of building an incredible body of work. So I said to Clive, I'm not sure I can do this. So Clive then came back to me after a while and invited me for a beer. And we said, okay, let's have a conversation again. In the meantime, Kenneth, through my wife, conveyed to me that he would, in fact, be very pleased if I accepted to edit the volume. So I said, okay, I can try to do this. And then through our conversations early on, there were two things that emerged for me. One was the what Kenneth has called left-of-center political orientation, I should say, to be humble and modest. Which was, you know, both present in his architectural work, in his design work early on. We just talked about it a moment ago, actually an hour ago, about the Corringham building, but also in his scholarly work. And particularly at the time when, particularly in 1980, the critical history comes out. At the same time, you know, the postmodern wave takes a great significance for architecture, but even above. And Kenneth single-handedly nearly, in fact, fought against the what he somewhere called the onslaught of postmodernism. I'm not going to repeat now the stories. I mean, the book actually contains a couple of stories about the Strada Novissima and the way in which Kenneth resigned from the committee chaired by Portuguesi. And then the way in which this critical history comes out, the year after, I believe, or 2 years later, also Architecture and the Critical Present. And then a year later, 6 points for the Architecture of Resistance, which I don't need to be laudatory. I'm not going to say what I think about it, but let me just say that K. Michael Hayes called it the masterpiece of architectural theory. And Mary McLeod said that this is a little bit of laudatory, but Mary McLeod said that this is probably the piece of architectural writing that was the most significantly influenced architectural practitioners and students of architecture and scholars than any other piece of architectural writing at the time, which is, I would say, even to this day. So at that moment, I think this political dimension of work becomes really instrumental and fundamental. I want to also read something that, very briefly, I'll read a few things and try to make my remarks as short as possible. There's something that, in fact, Richard Sennett wrote just that year, the year that Kenneth's book comes out. He says, "Never have the potential political consequences of architecture been greater," this is 1980, "and never has the political sensibility of architecture been less." And at that moment of friction, there comes, of course, Kenneth's work, the works that I just listed, which with full force offer another way of thinking about architecture, another way of framing architectural practice, a very forceful way, which, of course, is based on very much, let's call it then again, left of the center political orientation. Then the other thing those are, let's say, if we want to call it earthwork, so this is my earthwork then, that's one. And the other one is the lifelong commitment to the work of Hannah Arendt and of the, particularly the book Human Condition, but not only. Again, we had a brief conversation about this earlier today. And the space of appearance, the common world, the public common world, the distinctions between labor, work, and action. And I wanted to figure out how this book can in fact be structured with that foundation, and then with another dimension of the work that seemed to me super important, and that is I told Kenneth and Clive that I'm going to take tell a little story, which I thought was quite amazing and tells, in fact, really, for those of you who don't know Kenneth, tells about the passion and commitment. We were supposed to meet, my wife, Jilly Traganou, and Kenneth and I were supposed to meet in New York in one of the favorite places of Kenneth's, Le Monde, across the street from Columbia, for lunch. It was supposed to be a brief lunch. We wanted to catch up and so on and so forth. Kenneth is late. He comes in elated. He floats. And he comes in and he says, an incredible thing happened today. And we said, what happened? So he said, I was in the library today, and I just discovered this young Belgian architect, whose name I cannot recall, neither can Kenneth right now, but we may later, who actually created a megaform project, and then went on to work for Le Corbusier. And then in Le Corbusier's office, he actually was instrumental for the Algiers project. So that actually this project, in fact, really kind of pre-configured the megaform ideas you then find in Le Corbusier's work. And then Kenneth went on to tell us this story in amazing detail, which of course is an incredible pleasure. For those of you who don't know how that feels and what that means, Max is laughing, but he knows. It's an incredible pleasure. And so the meeting went on for 2.5 hours. And that story about the discovery and this whole idea of the genealogy of this form took quite a bit. So I'll speak for myself, we were both amazed. But what we were amazed about is not necessarily the young Belgian architect. That's an incredible discovery, of course. But what we were amazed about is that incredible curiosity, inquisitive scholarship, a commitment to inquiry of the highest caliber, and passion for the subject matter, which is so infectious that both of us left that lunch running, So that, in fact, I wanted that to be, if this was the earthwork, then this I wanted to be the structure. So in other words, what I was thinking about, and then Clive and Kenneth and I went back and forth, occasionally, a 6-year period, occasionally on it. What I was really interested in is then the other part, which is that part, which is the passion for inquiry. Where and how the inquiry came about, what are the pathways that have been created in such a long, in fact, productive body of work and history, and how would I find out what are the key questions that have driven Kenneth's work. And so another anecdote, which actually this one appears in the book partly, is that when we met and had the interview, Sylvia will remember that, that day, which was a very memorable, beautiful day. And Kenneth and I talked about a number of things, some of which you can read in the interview printed in the book. And then at some point, I said to Kenneth precisely this: I know that you have strong convictions, that you have such passion. I really wonder two things. One is, what are the questions? And I'm interested also in the following thing. If and when young people, and I know this is the case already today, and particularly in the future, when young people start studying your work, what do you think are the questions they should take on? And likewise, what are the questions you have taken on from the previous generations? So Kenneth stops, puts his hand on my arm, and says, I think this is the most significant question to date. I need to think about it. I will let you know later. So he said, I will write it down, and then I'll. So, you did in a certain way, but then I regretted, this is one of my regrets, I regretted not pressing you on that point that day. You wrote, and it was a very polite answer to this question, and then we massaged it back and forth, and in its final form, it's very different, of course, than it could have been if I pressed this question on. But the question, what I read to Kenneth, which I think both of us have been and were inspired by, and I got it from Gregory Ulmer, who you know, is the haiku of the Japanese haiku master Matsuo Basho, and the haiku is attributed to him, although nobody really knows if it was his or not, but it goes this way. It says, the point is not to follow in the footsteps of the masters, but to seek what they sought. And so the other thing that I wanted to ask, Kenneth didn't get a chance, they didn't get the answer, was in fact, are there any questions that did not find any answers? Is there anything that stayed without an answer? And those may be the things that young scholars, will take on, as well as some of the questions that you have taken on and that you have worked on, and they continue to be transcendentally present through architectural scholarship and studies over the many years. So in order to illustrate this, let me just briefly read something to you so that you get the understanding, and also that you understand where that appears in the book. So on page 166, we have, that's another thing that Clive has done before and that we wanted to do in this book as well. So there are quotes that precede each of the chapters. And then these quotes, in fact, really are meant to bring about some of the questions that Kenneth has explored, but also bring about the kind of the more free, because they're all transcribed from speeches and talks that Kenneth has given. By the way, I've seen every single thing available online, every lecture, everything. Plus, of course, have read everything published from 1969 until today, or last year, 2 years ago. So these are some of the things that resonated with us. So this particular one is from a senior lab scholar at Harvard, and this is, I was just looking at the date, 25th of October 2017, so basically 7 years ago, when Kenneth gave a lecture titled Megaform as Urban Landscape. which was in fact the title of a lecture given at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor in 1999, which then the University of Michigan published as a book, a brilliant little book, little because it's not massive, but it's, I don't know if any of you know it. And so Kenneth starts the lecture at Harvard with the following opening, and I'm quoting. My theme this evening, Megaform as Urban Landscape, has something of its origin half a century ago, when my initial experience of the urbanized region of the scale of Boston-Washington corridor, the megalopolis, for those of you who may not be familiar, was impressed upon my mind for the first time by actually taking a helicopter ride from Newark Airport at 5 p.m. on a summer evening and back to Kennedy Airport to fly back to London. I had never seen so much electrical power, this is the mid-60s, or gasoline burning before my eyes as one of those sublime panoramas that one is never likely to forget. So there are two things coincided at this time, Kenneth says. One was the experience of this urbanized region, and the other one was Hannah Arendt's book, The Human Condition, which first appeared in 1958, and from which, we touched upon it earlier today again, and from which I will never really recover in terms of the way she influenced my total attitude to architecture and to life in general. Where the first, the urbanized region, made me aware of the process of continuous, never-ending urbanization, the continual assembly of totally unrelated freestanding objects. The other, Arendt, introduced me to the provocative space of human appearance, with all the political and cultural connotations that this implies. And now comes the question. And thus, I first became preoccupied with something that has haunted me ever since, namely, by what means, both as a society and as a profession, may we hope to be able to maintain spaces of human appearance within an exceptionally privatized and highly commodified process of unending urbanization? So this is one of those lines of inquiry which persists from 1960s on until today. In concluding the 1999 lecture, which again is published as this book, Megaform as Urban Landscape, Kenneth says, says the following. Nevertheless, it is at least possible to indicate through a prognosis such as this one where the problem areas lie. No answers, but we know where the problem areas lie, which is, of course, as it should be. As I have suggested, the latter are not only cultural but also political. To be sure, saying so changes nothing. Nonetheless, it appears a crucial, if not quixotic, undertaking to articulate the condition, if for no other reason than that it is a way of contravening our prevalent tendency to fall into a kind of post-socialist euphoria, or should we say somnambulism, in which technocratic commodification is seen as inevitably determining every field of human endeavor without any redress. And there you have it. So the work is interlaced with these kinds of questions and then provisional closures that open up the work to further exploration. Therefore, these then gave us four major themes, which of course can be critiqued to be slightly over-encompassing, but it is hard to, of course, get to, organize such a body of work. And so the four themes are the human condition and the critical present, urban landscape and the eclipse of the public realm, which is where this particular piece I read from is, cross-cultural trajectories, place creation, note, not place making, place creation, and the politics of counterform, and the fourth, the predicament of architecture in the new millennium. And so my introductions and these composition of the essays within these four, we went back and forth many times over. Kenneth had very elegant, beautiful suggestions. Clive also brilliant suggestions at every single time. Sometimes painful, I should say, because it required me to rework quite a bit, but nevertheless extremely productive, as has been our wonderful relationship over the years. So in closing then, you get the sense of how the book is structured. The question for me was how to close the introductory chapter. Needless to say, again, one of the things that Clive, as the book series editor, defined was the number of words for each of the sections, for introductions and so on and so forth. I could have written much more. In fact, I did. And Clive said at some point, Miodrag, I think this is not publishable. So you remember that I told you. And so I went back to work. But what was really, because I, at some point in my life, and I continue to be, was a student of Kenneth's, and I know what does it feel to see him in the classroom. And so I wanted to close with this quote of one of Kenneth's favorite writers, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, which to me, as I write here, epitomize Frampton's matchlessly aspirational pursuit. And it goes like this, I quote, "If you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn, what is the pronunciation? Yearn, okay, for the vast and endless sea," which is how I feel. With that, I will give the word to Clive, and then Kenneth will expand on one of his texts that originally appeared in the book.
Okay, thank you, Miodrag. Just for information, which will become evident anyway, I am not an architect. I have played in architecture, but I am not one, so this is very important. I am, as Miodrag said, the founding editor of the series of which Ken's book is a part. I also have an afterword in it, which, if any of you have seen it so far, has a slightly offensive title on purpose. You'll see why. The book had its origin at about 2018 to 2019. As Miodrag said, it's taken more than 5 years to attain reality, even though it is one of the first books we planned. We planned 2 series. This was from a perspective of design, not architecture. The first series was just titled Designing in Dark Times. The second, Radical Thinkers in Design. The first series was planned as a series of emergent challenges to norms in design thinking. That was, if you like, that's its theoretical point. The second, Radical Thinkers, was a series that planned to bring back into critical thought in designing challenges to the present from texts that were in the past, but which I will call were nominally in the past. And I'll explain this term in a second because I think it's very important. So we were bringing the past here back in order to challenge the present and, by implication, open the future. Now, the basis of both series was skepticism that the present understands itself. And this is not only in architecture and design, totally, the globe, world. We do not understand our present, which means we do not understand what we have made. This is fundamental. The state of the world is the evidence for what I've just said. And if you live in America as I do now, with this, are fearful. There is no understanding of the present. So the second skepticism in the back of our minds was that works in design and architecture could be understood. And what I mean by this is my own sense that works, if I will use a daft, oversimple term, bad works of design were not understood in their destructiveness felt perhaps but not articulated. Equally, affirmative works were not understood in their virtues, in their capacity to engender, which is what I would say is that one of the rationales for when one says this work is worthwhile, this work is taking place. So there was this mixture was what I would define as limits to comprehension. And in using comprehension, I am using a term from Hannah Arendt, which she does in a book on imperialism, where she attacks those who try to explain away imperialism and fascism. And she uses the counter term, comprehension, to comprehend what is actually new, which is happening, and which is historically original. So it's the linkage here back to the Arendt is important. Now the question for us then was where to locate understanding. How could one locate a place? And in a sense, we had made that decision that there was two ways. One was to construct that understanding, designing in dark times, and the third series we've now opened called Beyond the Modern. And the second way was, as I've been suggested, to rescue critical texts from their nominal past. And what I mean their nominal past is because there is a peculiar quality of what I will call seminal or core works in criticism. They stand diagonally to the past and to the present simultaneously. Such works, I will argue, of the ones we've published, such works retain possibilities of thought which the present may not comprehend. That's why we go back to them. That's their role. They offer perspectives and resources for thought. Now, there's a direct analogy here, which is also a source of theft. Some of you may know the Verso series called Critical Thinkers. Their very extended library of political thought from the 20th century. We stole their title and added design. I am unashamed of this. What is it really that such works, Verso's and ours, I will now embrace them both, they offer resources. I will say resources is what critical thought does. There is a very sentence I love in Alain Badiou at one point where he's talking about philosophy, but it will do for critical thought. But he says, philosophy doesn't act directly in the world. He said it's like an attic where you store up resources and tools and sharpen your knives for the struggles to come. And I've always thought, this is beautiful. This gets it exactly. So that an obvious point to make, but it has struck me from the beginning of being involved in design. Criticism is not judgment. I mean, this is the most obvious thing to make. Kant has much to answer for. The jury system is not ice skating. I used to remember as a kid when you had ice skating on the TV, and the judges used to hold up their signs, 5.4, 5.3, 6.1. You might have a gold or you might have failed. Criticism is comprehension. It is understanding, sustained reflection on practice. And it's comprehension because practice does not know itself. It is one thing to do practice. It is quite another to actually comprehend what on earth it is that you've done. It is very difficult to do both in the same moment. Very difficult. So there is then, therefore, criticism has this role. Now, it is this sustained reflection on practice which allows criticism in the strong historical and practical sense to take a perspective on the present. And I think if we think about criticism, in my view, although we didn't quite articulate this enough in the book, I think now, it has three dimensions, I think, always to be. One is an analytic dimension. What is occurring in practice? What is happening in actuality? This is where criticism looks hard at things. Above all, what is decision in what happens? On what basis does decision take place? In whose interest? This question of decision, I think, is actually central here. The role here, the second one, is critical, of course, but what I mean by this now is the sense of what is and what is not in practice. It could be, for example, what is absent, what is indictment, what is limit. And criticism is the process of elucidating and naming what is not. It is unafraid of such naming, I think, here. It's to attempt to bring to speech, either critically or affirmatively. And the third element, which links to the affirmative, is that it is perspective, or it has a perspective. And this is the attempt to elucidate what the taking place of, say, architecture is. And in what would that taking place actually consist? Taking place here, I would define taking place, I'll mention this again, but more or less in terms of the realization of the potentiality inside a project, or inside a theme, or inside a discipline or a field. So the critical in total then is then the analytic play between these three moments. This analysis is conducted through history with a view to future practice. I'll just read one quotation from the interview with Ken, which is at the opening of the book, where he says this at one point. One thing so far is sure, namely that everything I have written has been written with the mind of an architect, one who has been obsessed with a vision of a liberative future that now seems unattainably utopian. I like this statement, not least because it is the conception that praxis is double, not single, and that the stakes are very high indeed. They are not simply within the discipline, they're larger than that. Now, what interests me too is that the more I've been thinking about this problem, and this was through the work, reading especially Ken's work, that this analytic play does not occur in a single dimension. It is a multiple activity. I can think of at least 6 modes. And these are not exclusive, they conjoin. Just to skim through these modes. I think the first mode of criticism that I could simply identify is to think the basis and the foundation of architecture. You will find this in the book, in various ways. It's also epitomized in the endorsement by Hal Foster on the back of the book. A very strong endorsement where Foster basically says, this is a certain conception on which architecture based, and really Kenneth's work is thinking out the analysis and advocacy for this view of the origin of architecture. The second one is to think the entanglements in which architecture is unavoidably involved. The third one, which is also, if you read the back of the book. We couldn't get a very nice summary of this. The third one, very similar, but I think not quite the same, is to seek to encompass the space of architecture and design. Now, space is here in the very largest sense. So, an encompass has a sense of being able to encompass all that is involved. And here I'll give a slightly fatuous play. When I was thinking about this concept of encompass, it suddenly came to mind the best, or the single most economic line on why Shakespeare I had ever heard. And I think this was given in a talk by the actor Ian McKellen. He asks a rhetorical question. Why do we keep reading and play and acting out Shakespeare? And he gives this lovely economic answer. He says, because inch for inch, Shakespeare gives us more. Now, I am not saying that Kenneth is the sort of, I can now say the bard of the Barbican. I'm not making that claim. I am rather saying that if we insert the word encompass in that and think of criticism which encompasses giving more inch for inch, this gives a sort of sense of why critical texts can resonate so far. So encompassing, the third virtue. And what I'm speaking about now are also virtues, almost in the Calvino sense of the term, if you think of the sixth commandment. The fourth one is actually the play between context, work, and decision. There is a beautiful paragraph that the art historian Michael Baxendale wrote in a book called Pattern of Intention, where Baxendale makes the lovely counterfactual point that the true originality in a work of art does not happen in the actual work of the work, if you like, painting the picture. He says that can be rather mechanical. What is truly personal, he says, is how the artist assesses the circumstances and context of the time, the moment. That, he says, is actually the more personal act. So this notion of paying attention to decision becomes extremely, and the play between context, work, and decision becomes key. The fifth point is to think practice from what I will call critique to taking place, which means the entire range of practice. From that which is the opposite of taking place, workers where the work or the environment we're talking about is actually dangerous, to the notion of the taking place in architecture, what we will often call an exemplary work. This range, to keep this range, both elements of this range intact. On the first one, the critique, my favorite paragraph or so here is an extended comment that Ken made in about 2002, 2003, and it's a little comment in a publication from Columbia about the state of architecture in the new millennium, and it's the report of a walk that two artists took from a storefront in Manhattan to JFK Airport, walked in a straight line, photographed, and Ken presents his appalled reading of this landscape, and it's savage, and it is justifiably so. This is the one is dealing, in other words, with two extremes. The sixth point is rather the one which I've actually already mentioned from Babadia, to think the resources, tools, and sharp knives that practice needs. What does practice need to help its comprehension of action? Seventh point would be to think project. Now, the point of that listing is to suggest here the intellectual and practical, and perhaps not least the political richness of critical thought in this sense. Another way of putting this is that criticism is perhaps worth more than we think, meaning that it potentially does more than we tend to think. Again, I blame Kant for this. Kant had a terrible, terrible effect on thought, on critical thought. And this now perhaps begins to suggest why Frampton, in the sense of why we wanted to publish Frampton. We didn't articulate it quite like this 5 years ago, but the intuition that there was something complex and vital here, that there was some possibility of criticism encapsulated in Ken's work, and we wanted to get at that. Now, I will just end on this last bit here too. If there is also a second reason why to publish in relation to criticism, because if criticism is powerful, it is at the same time far more vulnerable than we tend to think. Now, this is very enigmatic in relationship to Ken, and probably needs more elucidation than I can give it now in a second. One would have thought that Ken's work, project, is absolutely secure. The person who began to publish modern architecture in 1980 and now in the 5th edition of an ever larger book, let alone the popularity of an essay like Critical Regionalism, should surely secure a position. And yet I would say to you that there are 3 art exhibitions in London at the moment, 3 very intelligent exhibitions, by the way, I think, which actually tell us something about this. I'm referring to the exhibitions of Francis Bacon's portraits, Monet's series in London, and to the Van Gogh show of the last 2. Now, what do they tell us? They tell us that one of the problems about visibility is that the presence of artist or thinker takes over from the project. It takes over from actually, in a certain way, looking at the work. What those 3 exhibitions try and do is to force the gallery goer to look otherwise and therefore reconsider the projects. Certainly yesterday, just looking at Bacon's portraits, it's a revelation. You do not leave the exhibition with the same quiet view of Bacon as you had. And I think this is an exact analogy to what we did. If you like, we curated or re-curated Kenneth. Not that it particularly needs it, but we decided we would do that. We would the analogy will suffice. So the book can be conceived of as, in fact, a deliberate attempt to curate a project. And the emphasis on project here, which is an emphasis I make in the afterword, is important. We have to consider and to remember that the ideology of now, the world, global ideology, is the denial of project. To live without idea, Badiou's summary of this. Caesar noted this in a letter to Ken, which we quote in the book. Caesar says in a letter to Ken, despairing moment, how can I have projects when Europe has no project? He's getting at the same problem here, which reminds us, and should remind you, that if one does not construct an adequate project, it is constructed for you, and by and large, you will not like it. So architecture in the public world, then, is an attempt to articulate project and the possibility of project. It's critique. The book makes very little critique of Ken. Why would you? And yes, of course, yeah, one could, but we don't.
Certainly could.
Because the book itself is a critique. It is a critique of our times, and that is its important. That is its politics, and that's why we unashamedly did the book. Okay, thank you.
Yes, well, here I am. All right. I have a few notes. That was a beautiful presentation. In fact, they were both beautiful presentations, and as you must already have understood, that there are so many people to whom I'm indebted for the production and editing of these collected essays that I hardly know where to begin. First and foremost, of course, my long-standing colleague and friend, Miodrag Mitrosinovic, whose commitment to editing all this material testifies to the scale and extent of his commitment to the book as a whole, particularly the interviews and introductions that we managed to construct together throughout the book. I'm equally indebted, of course, to Clive Tilnott, who, apart from being one of the sharpest critics of architecture, and I think probably one of the sharpest critics I know as a whole, I have had the honor of listening to on many occasions. Also, of course, I have in mind his discerning editorship of the Bloomsbury Press Radical Thinkers Design Series, which includes, just prior to this publication, the writings of the distinguished German designer Guy Bonsipi, who played a fundamental pedagogical role in the formation of the Hochschule für Gestaltung in Ulm, and who wrote in the final issue of the school magazine at the moment of its closure in 1968, and I quote him, "Industrial societies need intelligence to remain alive. One brand of intelligence is taken into service, but critical intelligence is desired to a lesser degree or not at all." In an earlier version of my essay on Ulm, this laconic critique appeared above an equally pertinent observation by Bonsipi's colleague, Thomas Maldonado, who wrote on the same occasion, "The fundamental question in judging the work of a bourgeois intellectual is not to determine whether it includes reactionary elements or not. Rather, one must ascertain whether these elements constitute a universe in expansion or contraction. In my own intellectual work, there is a constant attempt to reduce the reactionary components that could invade the theory that it formulates." In an earlier version of this essay on Ulm, I mentioned also the third member of the Marxist triad, one might say, that were present in the Hochschule für Gestaltung, the so-called High School for Design, in the 60s. The third person being the Swiss architect Claude Schneid, who wrote around the same time the following, that is, at the time of the school coming to a close in 68. In the days, this is Schneid, in the days when the pioneers of modern architecture were still young, they thought like William Morris that architecture should be an art of the people for the people. But they had reckoned without the commercial instincts of the bourgeoisie. Utility quickly became synonymous with profitability. Anti-academic forms became the new decor of the ruling classes. And he goes on, the environment was transformed into a gigantic enterprise for the degradation of the human habitat. In each instance, the words are the words of my left-wing cultural heroes from the forgotten heroic moment of the student revolt of '68, extending from the bloodless so-called Les Événements du Mai in Paris, wherein the paving stones were relatively benevolently answered by tear gas and water cannons, as opposed to the wholesale massacre of students at the hands of the military in Mexico City. I mean, this student revolt was, strangely enough, worldwide. I am grateful to Miodrag for prefacing these essays with a quote from my ethically heroic amanuensis, namely, of course, the profoundly perceptive Hannah Arendt, which brings me to a moving citation from her 1955 book, Men in Dark Times, words which, given the ruthless genocide to which we are witness on a daily basis, now seem to be even more painfully pertinent than when she wrote them 70 years ago. I quote, that even in the darkest times, we have a right to expect some illumination, and that such illumination may well come less from theories and concepts than from the uncertain flickering and often weak light that some men and women in their lives and their works will kindle under almost all circumstances and shed over the time span that was given to them on earth. Our eyes that are so used to darkness as ours will hardly be able to tell whether their light was the light of a candle or that of a blazing sun. But such objective valuation seems to me to be of secondary importance and can be safely left to posterity. I mean, it's yet another example of a most elegant use of the English language. It is something of an embarrassment to have to admit that there are a number of texts that I have written at certain moments in my life that now totally astonish me in retrospect for their clarity of reasoning, above all because I thought after their initial publication that they were not only inadequate but also confused, only later to find in rereading them for this occasion that they seem in retrospect to be lucidity itself. One such text, which I will touch on here, is a so-called philosophical excursus incorporated into an essay entitled Towards an Ontological Architecture, incorporated into a into a 2015 publication of the results of my teaching of a course entitled Comparative Critical Analysis of Built Form, which was published by Lars Muller in Zurich under the misleading title A Genealogy of Modern Architecture. Amongst other issues, this essay addresses the time-honored interplay between tradition and innovation, a topic which has been elaborated at length by both Zygmunt Bauman in his thesis on critical praxis and Hans-Georg Gadamer in his magnum opus, Truth and Method, of 1960, wherein he writes, and I quote, "A work of architecture extends beyond itself in two ways. It is as much determined by the aim which it is to serve as by the place it is to take up in the total spatial context. Through this dual ordering, the building presents a true increase in being, and please note the use of the term being. Gadamer goes on, a building is never primarily a work of art. Its purpose, through which it belongs to the context of life, cannot be separated from itself without losing some of its reality. If it has become mostly an object of aesthetic consciousness, then it has mostly a shadowy reality and lives a distorted life only in the degenerate form of an object of interest to tourists or a subject for photography. In effect, my essay, Towards an Ontological Architecture, is an attempt at a phenomenological mode of beholding built culture, focused on Hannah Arendt's seminal work of 1958, The Human Condition. Arendt never refers either to Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, nor to Martin Heidegger, who was Husserl's pupil and Arendt's own mentor, excuse me, and which she never alludes to Husserl's phenomenological slogan, back to the things themselves, this kind of desperate physicist who is at odds with both metaphysical logic on the one hand and the other worldliness of science on the other. She nonetheless emphasizes the existential conditions under which the things come into being, discriminating between those things produced by labor, which are destined for immediate consumption, and those things produced by the agency of work, which corresponds to the unnaturalness of human existence and whose mortality is not compensated by the species' ever-recurring life cycle. Work produces an artificial world of things. Within its borders, each individual life is housed, while this world itself is meant to outlast them all. End quote. It is surely significant for architects that Arendt's somewhat eccentric distinction between the seeming synonyms of labor and work corresponds to the double definition of architecture in the Oxford English Dictionary. In the first instance between, I quote, action and process of building, and in the second, the erection of edifices for human use. While the same dictionary will define edifice as a large and stately building such as a church, a palace, or a fortress, that is to say, as a monumental microcosmos designed to endure against the erosive forces of time. Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception of 1945 retroactively augments the ontological implications of the human condition by introducing the concept of the body being as the prime agency through which we experience the world. This recognition is intimately linked to our motility through which we experience space, as Merleau-Ponty puts it. In the action of the hand, which is raised towards an object, is contained a reference to the object, not as an object represented, but as that highly specific thing towards which we project ourselves. Consciousness is being towards the thing through the intermediary of the body, which enables us to understand motility in terms of intentionality. Sight and movement are specific ways of entering into relationship with objects. It is the momentum of existence which does not cancel out the radical diversity of its contents because it links them to each other via the intermediary unity of a world. In all of the above, I have attempted to trace a mode of beholding that Jonathan Hale has characterized as a critical phenomenology, in which the body being depends upon a corporeal collective. This thesis was first advanced by the Austrian psychoanalyst Paul Schilder in his book Die Körperschema, The Body Image, of 1923. In the last analysis, one is left with the challenge as to in rereading this essay, as to what exactly do I intend by the idea of an ontological architecture, which the essay itself never fully specifies. And finding myself pressed post facto for an answer, I have to say that I have had in mind at the time, and again now, a phenomenologically accessible tactile architecture in which the subject is simultaneously sustained and stimulated by an architecture designed to accommodate the body being, the corpus schema, let us say, of the multiple persona. That's the interesting thing that both Merleau-Ponty and Schilder think of perception in terms of multiple perception, multiple bodies, in other words, mutually perceiving together in a manner that is simultaneously both representative of its presence, of the collective presence, and commemorative of its moment in time in relation to the tradition from which it stems. Yes, I think I have more or less said what I have to say, and we could sort of open the room to discussion. But before we do so, I would like to fill in a few details, such as the figure that first recommended that I should read Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition was the mythical figure of Sam Stevens, who for many years taught history theory in this school and was notorious for actually having studied in the court hold, etc., and so on, for rushing into the slide library, grabbing slides in a frantic fashion and loading them into the carousel, and then talking, because he was a talking head that could talk about anything, and it wasn't very coherent, but it was always very stimulating. The other figure I have to mention is Dalibor Vézelay, who gave me his own copy of Georg Gadamer's Truth and Method, which I regret to say I have since mislaid and have had to buy another copy. But this Vézelay is, Vézelay is someone who has been involved with the phenomenological throughout his academic career, even before he came to Britain, and all those years that he taught at Cambridge. I think he has been the kind of father of phenomenology inside British architecture education. And I thought Peter Carl might be here this evening, but I don't think he is, because Peter, of course, worked with him very closely. So that's all I have to say in response to the very pertinent contributions made by my colleagues, left and right. And now I think we could open the floor to a little discussion, maybe.
Okay. It's very nice to see you, Ken. I've been following your works at least for over 40 years, since I started architecture with modern architecture. And also when I came to London, just shortly after the publication of Critical Regionalism, on, studies in tectonic culture. And we have also crossed paths at Columbia in '93 when you moved there. But I was listening very carefully, and I've always been puzzled and wanted to raise this question to you. And you give me the hook, how to turn this point around or bring it out? Because you mentioned Gadamer and his critique of an aestheticizing connoisseur-style engagement with the work, which would be contrasted with it being kind of a living, breathing interaction with it and across it. And when I've seen you before and heard about your concept of phonology, the way you talk to Merleau-Ponty, use him, refer to maybe to people like Dalibor, but also which you also rephrase as the ontological engagement. And I understand a lot of this. My understanding of this would be, and this is a question, would you agree, it comes across as a form of connoisseurship, kind of how I'm engaging with the sculpture. I feel in a building, the reverberation of the floor, the hardness or softness, and how I engage, and is a kind of interesting perception of how I'm in the world. But it remains to me, and that's why you can compare it to an engagement with a sculpture where you feel maybe the weight of your body very different, something fragile or something very steel. You feel your own fragility, you like an egg in front of a steel sculpture. But how does it connect up with what I would say, for me, phonology is, and I have to kind of refound the concept, is a perception of a social situation through all my senses, of smell, of light, shadow, of heaviness, of understanding quickly, orienting in a social space to understand and engage in a configuration. And so that was the first part of the question. Wouldn't that have to connect? I mean, it always felt there is this kind of missing link. Why, would I draw on all senses and fully engage? The final purpose must be recognizing social situation to be engaged more and more immediately, and be also presencing in the space of appearance. By the way, also been witnessing George Baird when I was in '94 in Harvard. The book just came out and he debated this material. So, and I have a follow-on question. And I think you seem to get where I get them. Once we have that, let's say, space of communicative interaction, and also the Habermasian heightened notion of communicative action, interaction versus strategic. And we know that we need each other, we're looking out for engaging truthfully and sharing and co-creating purposes. And for that we need that public space. And I'm very much aware of this. But then I'll give you another hint. I'm sure you're aware of Habermas and the incomplete project of modernism, something Zaha picked up from you. It rings in my ear, the incomplete and I know it comes through you. But my point is now, and that's is the second challenge, particularly looking at Habermas, his book on the transformation of the public realm and public space and Öffentlichkeit. Couldn't that be also privately? I mean, then now contrasting with this, you're kind of, I was, by the way, also on the left of center, and way left of center. But is it really necessary? You're talking about the world of commodification, of privatization, and in my world now, in my worldview, I see there's no contradiction. A public space, space of appearance and of political engagement and discourse can be privately hosted, privately owned and set up, like the salons of Paris, which generated the first kind of, and also the bourgeoisie is in fact that class who developed the public realm in its truest forms. And in fact, and later with Habermas, you had actually in kind of social democracy, in the welfare state, where you saw the kind of degeneration of that through a bureaucratized kind of left project. So that's my challenge. I believe in the private initiatives, and the AA is a private institution, for generating the space of appearance. So that's my challenge to you, a double challenge.
Well, it's a lot. It's a lot. And yes, I mean, these are recent thoughts. I think, that the megalopolis, first of all, is a historical reality of absolutely prodigious proportions. We have urban conglomerations, as you know, ranging from 15 to 20 to 30 million people, far in excess of many sovereign nation states, particularly in Europe. If you think of Scandinavia, for example, these mega cities have populations that far exceed anything, in Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Norway. I mean, populations are minute compared to the mega cities of Southeast Asia and South America. So that phenomena, I think, is kind of overwhelming, both experientially and otherwise. So that is the phenomena produced by capitalism, by private investment, and by no planning whatsoever, of course. An example of it in a sort of micro sense would be the development of south of the river Vauxhall. I mean, totally irrational. One has absolutely no idea who thought that this was an appropriate way of handling the site. One is just, left speechless because there is no planning. And it's very significant that there used to be in Britain a Ministry of Town and Country Planning, which was direct translation of Ebenezer Howard's, of course, Tomorrow a Peaceful Path to Rural Reform, this whole dialectic between town and country. But at some point in the 70s, of course, it was changed because it was, I suppose, in some sense, an embarrassment to the Department of the Environment. That was a very significant change, I think. This with many problematic consequences of this change. Very abstract term, Department of the Environment. And as I'm saying this, I'm reminded of the astonishing fact that in 1951, Mies is on record, Mies van der Rohe, for saying, because he'd been 16 years in the United States, so he knew what he was talking about, that is why we cannot build cities anymore, old cities, planned cities. It goes on like a forest, and we have to learn to live in the jungle and even do well by that. This is Mies, 1951. And it's astonishing, I think. And this incapacity, which is really, one is talking about incapacity, is very sobering. I mean, 1972, that's the last British new town, Milton Keynes. Will the present government build a new town? Very questionable. And how would they do it also? Another problem. I think that we do live in dark times from this point of view. And from other points of view, of course, much more serious than this particular darkness, I would say. So the question of the position of the architect, in relation to the scale of the problem, is a very big question. And I've recently thought that, one of the problems with the modern project, which I was very much into and would remain with, of course, 1980 is the emergence, stylistically speaking, of post-modernity in the Venice Biennale, anticipated intellectually by La Condition Postmoderne, philosophically speaking, and that for me was of course a sort of something of a shock because Modern Architectural Critical History, published exactly at that moment in 1980, had been written, I think, throughout its length as a kind of operative history, to use the denigratory view of Manfredo Tafuri, and history committed to the idea of the modern movement. But I think the advent of postmodernity forces one to rethink where exactly where exactly are we from the point of view of historical reality. And not only the megalopolis, but also the question of exactly what should be the format of built form, and this issue is by no means clear, I think, today. And it brings to my mind the importance of the environment, the importance of landscape, topography, and sustainability in relation to the predicament of architecture, really, architecture qua architecture. And from this point of view, I think landscape has more to give to architecture than the other way around. And finally, that the last comment I have to make, because I realize that it isn't really a very direct answer to your intervention, is that I have of recent date become more and more interested in Alvar Aalto because of his attitude towards topography and because of his attitude to the what I would call the tactile experience of the subject. I mean, a more phenomenological architect is hard to identify within the spectrum of so-called masters. And from this point of view, I think his legacy is, and there is an essay in the book about the legacy of Alvar Aalto, I think his legacy remains extremely important. So I detect in your intervention, a certain kind of challenge about private investment versus public investment. Maybe it's simplifying what you said, but I think we will not be able to do anything substantial about the climate crisis and about the rapacity of late capitalism, and about, above all, public transport without public investment, because the private investment is never going to answer the need for public transport. For that matter, of course, it's not going to answer the need for housing either. So we are in this predicament whether we like it or not. I don't see, I can't see it in any other way.
Can I just add briefly? However, yes, and however, I think this is also the point that clearly comes through the book, and Clive was also after it. We should not give up. So in other words, it's not that we cannot or we can. We should not. We ought to persist. And the reason why is because even if you go back, obviously the title of the book comes from Hannah Arendt. Even if you go back to Arendt, you will find that, for example, the distinction between social and political, which you bring, as dimensions of in both questions, or as many questions as they were embedded there. Which is, there's a very clear separation also between economic and political. The fact she argues that we today, 1950s, like late 1950s or mid 1950s, we no longer can distinguish between the two, as in political economy, is a fallacy. That in fact we should be able to, because public is political. And so even if you go back to Kenneth's writings and go back to Hannah Arendt, you see that connection to an impossibility of imagining that a privately owned entity would actually be able to be the political to the extent to which we need it to be. If you read, for example, there is a beautiful book by Margaret Cohn, a legal scholar. The book is called Brave New Neighborhoods. I don't know if you know it. But from a legal perspective, she says absolutely not. So it is not possible to imagine that private property, because when we talk about private, we talk about property, right? We talk about economy, we talk about ownership. That private property would actually be able to create a type of political discourse we need today in order to be able, not to resolve, but to be able to discuss, as Clive was pointed out, to be able to discuss the frame and discuss the issues that are pertinent today. So most directly, I would say the answer is no, as far as I'm concerned. But that may be a provocation for another conversation.
I'd really like to be able to take some other questions. Is there anyone else who would like to answer a question?
It's a question that arose to me with what has been said around the table, whether had you stayed in the UK rather than emigrate to America for a period of 50 years, would you have been a different kind of critic? And what I have in mind is that in America there is a great divide between the intellectual world and how can I put it, the commercial world, or so it seems, or perhaps academia and the practical world, commercial world outside. The situation here, one sometimes here, is the same, but actually it's not the same. It's quite different in many ways. It's milder. And the position of architects, and I think the position of critics in the UK is a different one, it seems to me.
Yeah. Well, I don't quite know what to say. I think, yes, you use the term milder, and I think, yes, I think it might be put more directly. You know, I think I would have to say that the United States, I was a very naive figure when I went to the United States in the mid-60s. And I would like to say that the US politicized me, basically, without a doubt. And and whether that would have happened here, there's another issue, I think. I'm not sure. There's somebody I know from the past who's I don't know whether he's still alive or not. He's an architect named Mike Glickman, who once said to me, you have to remember, in Britain the claws are hidden, but here you can see them. And that is an incredible, wise observation, I think. And so, I mean, if the claws are hidden, maybe that produces a softer critic, if you know what I mean. But I don't think of myself as a particularly hard critic either. But you know, it's I don't know what to say really. I think what if? I don't know the answer. Yes.
We can have one more question, and then we can have a drink together and have a more informal arena for speaking to Kenneth and the other two panelists. Is there one more question? Well, if not, we can share a drink together and have that more informal conversation. Thank you so much. I think it's always a pleasure to have you here. A fantastic conversation this evening.